Adriano Falcone laughed. That was the thing Seraphina would never forget. Not the woman's hands on his chest, not the champagne on the nightstand, or the way his jacket was draped over the chair like he owned that room. The same way he thought he owned everything else. What she could not unhear, what followed her down 42 floors in a silent elevator and never left, was the laugh. Low, relaxed, happy. She had not heard that laugh in 3 years. She stood outside that penthouse door for 4 seconds. She counted them later, lying awake at 3 a.m. with one hand on her stomach. 4 seconds of watching her husband of 20 years hold another woman and laugh, and plan a future that had already erased her from it. Then Seraphina De Luca put the anniversary gift back into her purse, turned around, and walked away. No tears. No scene. No last words. Just the quiet click of elevator doors closing behind her. If you've ever loved someone completely, given them 2 decades of your life, your loyalty, your silence about things, decent people would have left over, then you already know the kind of pain this story is about. Not the loud kind. The kind that sits down inside you and stays. Stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what Seraphina did next is not what anyone expected, including the man who thought he had already won. If this story finds you today, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The night started the way most dangerous nights do, quietly, with a text message. Seraphina was in the kitchen when her phone buzzed against the marble counter. She was arranging flowers, white peonies, because Adriano had once told her, 10 years ago, that they were the only flower that didn't look like it was trying too hard. She had remembered that. She always remembered the small things he said, even when he'd stopped saying them. The text read, "Urgent meeting with Hartwell Group, don't wait up." She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down and went back to the flowers. The Hartwell Group. She knew that name, had helped Adriano cultivate that relationship 4 years ago, back when the empire's expansion into the Northeast was still fragile, and every handshake mattered. She had sat across from their representative at a dinner in Boston, redirected a conversation that was about to collapse, and saved a deal Adriano hadn't even realized was falling apart. He never thanked her for that. Not exactly. He'd come home that night and said, "That went well." The same way a man might comment on traffic. She picked up her phone again. 9:47 p.m. Their reservation at Carbone, the one she'd made 3 weeks ago for their anniversary, had been for 8. She'd canceled it herself when he texted at 7:30. She stood at the counter for a long moment, fingers resting on the cold marble. Then she picked up her coat. It wasn't suspicion that moved her. She would be honest about that later, to herself if no one else. It wasn't the voice in the back of her head that she'd been quieting for the past year and a half, the one that noticed small things. A different cologne, a phone turned face down, the way he sometimes looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't figured out how to solve yet. It wasn't any of that. What moved her was something simpler and more humiliating. She missed him. She was 7 months pregnant, she had just canceled their anniversary dinner, and she missed the version of him she kept trying to find in the man who came home late and slept with his back to her. She was going to surprise him, bring him coffee, maybe. Sit in the lobby and wait until the meeting ended and just see him. Just be near him. She called the car herself. Didn't tell anyone where she was going. That decision would define the next 2 years of her life. The Falcone organization kept 3 properties for private business: a law office downtown, a suite at the Langham, and a penthouse on the 53rd floor of the Caldwell Tower that Seraphina herself had negotiated into the portfolio 6 years ago. The Caldwell penthouse was for sensitive conversations, the kind where you didn't want a hotel concierge knowing which faces came and went. She had chosen it for exactly that reason. She had thought, at the time, that she was protecting them. The elevator required a private code. She entered hers, because she had always insisted on having her own access to every property, a habit that Adriano had once called unnecessarily cautious, and she had called basic intelligence, and rode up alone. The doors opened to a short hallway. The penthouse entrance was straight ahead, maybe 30 feet. The door was not quite closed. That was the first thing she noticed. The door. Adriano was meticulous about closed doors. It It was almost pathological, something his mother had hammered into him, the idea that open doors were invitations for the wrong kind of attention. He checked locks the way other people check their phones, compulsively, before bed, before meetings, always. He had never once left a door open, but this one was. Just slightly. Just enough that the sound reached her before the image did. His voice first. Lower than usual, the register he used when he was relaxed. Really relaxed. Not the performance of relaxation he offered at dinners and the rare family events he tolerated. She had not heard that voice in a long time. Then a woman's laugh. Musical and unbothered, the laugh of someone who had nothing to fear. Then his laugh. Joining hers. Easy. Seraphina stopped walking. Later, weeks later, in a quiet apartment on the other side of the city, she would try to reconstruct what she felt in that hallway in the seconds before she reached the door. She could never do it accurately. There was something physical, like a shift in pressure, the way the air changes before a storm moves in. There was something almost like detachment, like part of her climbed out of her own body and stood slightly to the left and watched. She reached the door. She looked through the gap. She did not see everything. She saw enough. Adriano, jacket off, tie loose, sitting on the edge of the window seat with the city behind him. A woman. Dark hair, fitted dress, the effortless posture of someone who had spent a lifetime being looked at, sitting beside him, her hand on his chest. Not seductively, comfortably. The way you touch someone you have touched 100 times. They were talking. She couldn't hear all of it. Their voices rose and fell, but she caught enough. A phrase that landed like a fist. After the baby comes, he files. She won't fight it. She's practical. The woman's voice, confident, almost amused. And Adriano. She'll take the settlement and disappear. She's always known when she's not wanted. Seraphina's hand tightened on her purse. He laughed again. That same laugh. Easy, relaxed, happy. She stood there for 4 seconds. She counted them. 1. She confirmed what she was seeing. 2. She let herself feel it. All of it. The full weight of it. 3. She made a decision. 4. She acted on it. She reached into her purse, past the small wrapped box, a watch, the kind he'd mentioned once in passing, Italian-made, which she had spent 2 months tracking down, and she let it stay there. She zipped the purse closed. She turned around. She walked back to the elevator at the same pace she'd arrived. Her heels made the same sound on the floor. Her breathing was controlled. The elevator came. She stepped in. The doors closed. She rode down 42 floors in complete silence. In the lobby, she passed the front desk without looking at it. She pushed through the glass doors into the cold night air and stood on the sidewalk for exactly 3 seconds. She counted those too, before her car arrived. She got in. Home? The driver asked. No, she said. Take me to Gideon. Gideon Mercer picked up on the second ring. It was past 10 o'clock, and she could hear the television in the background. The news, probably. The man had never been able to sleep without it. And she could also hear the exact moment he registered something in her voice, because the television went quiet. Where are you? He asked. On my way to you. Are you hurt? No. A pause. Seraphina, I need you to start pulling documentation, she said. Everything. Ownership agreements, trust filings, the proxy arrangements from 2019, the amendment we made to the charter after the Chicago acquisition. All of it. Silence. Gideon. I heard you. His voice was careful. Gideon Mercer was 61 years old and had been practicing law for 35 of them, mostly in rooms where the wrong sentence could get a man killed. He did not rattle easily, but she could hear something careful happening in his tone, a kind of deliberate steadiness. Can you tell me what happened? Yes, she said, but not tonight. Tonight I need you to pull the files. Can you do that? Another pause, shorter this time. I'll have everything on the table when you arrive. She ended the call. She sat back. Outside the window, the city moved past her in streaks of light. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved. A slow roll, the kind of movement she'd gotten used to in the past few weeks. Half turn, small elbow or knee, pressing briefly against her palm. She felt it, and breathed through it, and did not cry. That surprised her a little. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something she hadn't expected and couldn't immediately name. It was only later, in the quiet of Gideon's office, with legal files spread across his conference table and her fourth cup of decaf going cold beside her, that she identified it. Clarity. That was what it was. 20 years of noise, of managing and protecting and smoothing and staying, always staying. And now, suddenly, clarity. She had always known, somewhere below her conscious thought, that this empire had been built on two pairs of hands. Adriano's name was on the buildings. But her name, her legal name, in her precise handwriting, was in the paperwork that mattered. She had made sure of that. Not out of distrust, she had told herself at the time. Out of practicality. She was a practical woman. Everyone said so. Adriano had said it himself tonight. She's always known when she's not wanted. He was right about that. She had always known. She had known for a year and a half, probably longer if she was honest, which she was trying to be. What he hadn't understood, what he had fundamentally, catastrophically miscalculated, was what a practical woman does once she knows. Gideon's office was in a brownstone on 72nd Street. He buzzed her up himself and met her at the door in reading glasses and a cardigan, which meant he'd been home for hours, which meant the files he'd already pulled when she arrived were files he kept close. He handed her a coffee. Real coffee, she noticed, not decaf, which meant he understood this was not a night for accommodations, and led her to the conference table without saying anything. She sat down. She looked at the documents laid out in front of her. For a long moment, she didn't speak. "You already knew something was wrong," she said finally. It wasn't a question. Gideon sat down across from her and took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. He was the kind of man who told you hard things by being very still, as if motion might make them harder. "I've been watching some financial movement," he said, "over the last 14 months. Transfers I couldn't explain and didn't recognize. I wanted to be sure before I brought it to you." She looked at him. "Why didn't you come to me when you first noticed?" He met her eyes. "Because I was hoping I was wrong." She nodded slowly. She understood that. She had been hoping she was wrong for a year and a half. "Tell me what you found," she said. He told her. It took 2 hours. By the time Gideon finished, the coffee had gone cold and Seraphina had filled 6 pages of a yellow legal pad with her neat, small handwriting. Amounts, dates, entity names, account numbers. The scope of it was worse than she had imagined, and she had, on the drive over, tried to imagine the worst. Adriano and Vivian Sinclair, that was the woman's name, she confirmed it from the documents Gideon had pulled, had been quietly, methodically draining the empire's liquidity through a network of shell corporations registered in 3 different countries. The transfers had started small. That was the sophistication of it. They started small, built a pattern of legitimate-looking activity, and then scaled. Over 14 months, the total moved was significant enough that recovery would have been, at best, complicated. At worst, impossible. And that wasn't all. "The voting rights," Gideon said, pushing a document toward her. "The amendment to the shareholder agreement last spring. Do you remember signing this?" She looked at it. "I never signed this." He nodded. He had known that. He had pulled the signature pages for comparison. Her signature, on a document she had never seen, executing a proxy transfer that would have effectively moved controlling interest in the organization's core holdings out of her hands. Forged, precise enough to fool a standard review. Not precise enough to fool Gideon Mercer, who had watched her sign her name across 30 years of paperwork and knew every habit of her handwriting down to the way she crossed her T's. "When was this filed?" she asked. April. 4 months ago. When she was in her second trimester and Adriano had been particularly attentive, bringing her tea, asking about her doctor's appointments, being the version of a husband she'd been trying to find for years. She had been grateful. She had told herself things were getting better. She set the document down. She looked at Gideon. "They were planning this before I was pregnant," she said. "Likely before you announced it, yes." "The baby was an acceleration," she said, thinking it through aloud. "They needed to move faster because a child changes the inheritance structure." "Yes." "And Lucinda?" The name came out of her with a flatness she hadn't intended. Gideon didn't answer immediately, which was, itself, an answer. "There are emails," he said carefully, "between Lucinda and Vivian Sinclair. I haven't verified all of them yet, but the ones I've reviewed suggest that Lucinda introduced them, has been actively encouraging the relationship for at least 2 years. 2 years. 2 years ago, Lucinda Falcone had sat at Seraphina's dinner table on Christmas Eve and told her that she thought of her as a daughter. She had held Seraphina's hand. She had cried a little, talking about the future, about grandchildren someday, about how glad she was that Adriano had found someone with real strength. Seraphina had believed her. She breathed in slowly, out slowly. She did this 3 times while Gideon waited. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated carefully. "We don't move yet." She looked at the legal pad in front of her, at the 6 pages of evidence, at the documents spread across the table. "I need more. I need it airtight. I need it to be the kind of thing that can't be unwound and can't be disputed and can't be—" She paused, finding the word, survived. Gideon studied her for a moment. He had known her for 20 years. He had watched her navigate things that would have broken other people. And he had watched her do it without performance, without drama, just the same quiet precision that had always made him slightly awed by her. "How long do you need?" he asked. She thought about it. "Enough time for them to get comfortable," she said. "If they think I don't know, they'll keep moving. They'll make mistakes. Comfortable people always do." She gathered the legal pad, folded it, put it in her purse. Then she stood up, slowly, one hand on the table for balance, the baby making its weight felt, and picked up the cold coffee and drank the rest of it. "Don't contact me through any of the usual channels," she said. "Get a clean line. I'll do the same." Gideon stood. He looked like he wanted to say something beyond the professional, something human, the kind of thing you said to someone you'd watched build a life and then watched have it taken from underneath her without her making a sound. What he said was, "You're sure you're all right?" She considered the question the way she considered all questions, genuinely, briefly, without performance. "I'm not," she said, "but I will be." She left. The car took her to a hotel, not a Falcone property, a small place in Midtown she'd once used for an off-the-books meeting years ago and never connected to any of their holdings. She paid in cash. She gave a false name. She took the stairs to the 4th floor and let herself into a room that smelled like industrial cleaning products and someone else's choices. And she sat on the edge of the bed in her coat and her heels with her purse in her lap. And then, alone, she allowed herself 2 minutes. She put her face in her hands. She breathed. She felt everything she had not let herself feel in the elevator, in the lobby, in the car, in Gideon's office. The full weight of it, all 20 years of it. The investment of herself that had no name in any accounting ledger, but was more real than any number on any document. She felt it. She did not cry. She had thought she might, in this room alone, finally. But what came instead was not tears. It was something more internal, a kind of rearranging, like the moment after a very large sound when the silence that follows has a different quality than the silence before. 2 minutes. Exactly. Then she lifted her face from her hands, took off her coat, and reached into her purse for the yellow legal pad. She had work to do. On the nightstand, the anniversary gift. The watch, the Italian-made one she'd spent 2 months tracking down, sat still wrapped in its paper. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened the nightstand drawer and put it inside and closed the drawer and picked up her pen. Adriano Falcone had been building an empire for 20 years. He had been very good at it, mostly, because he had married someone better at it than he was. He just hadn't understood that yet. He would. She did not sleep. Not because she couldn't. The bed was fine, the room was quiet, and her body, 7 months into carrying another human being, was running on a kind of deep physical exhaustion that had nothing to do with rest. She didn't sleep because every time she closed her eyes, she heard the laugh again. That low, relaxed, happy sound coming through a door that should have been closed from a man she had handed 2 decades of her life to. She lay on top of the covers in the hotel room with the lights off and the yellow legal pad on the pillow beside her, and she stared at the ceiling and let her mind work. That was what she did when things were bad. Not cry, not spiral, work. She made lists in her head. She ordered things. She found the shape of a problem and turned it until she could see every angle. Adriano had always said she thought like a machine. He'd meant it as a compliment once. Later it had started to sound like something else. She thought about April, the forged signature, the proxy transfer that had been filed quietly, buried inside a stack of routine amendments, designed to slide past anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Whoever had drafted that document knew her signature well enough to approximate it convincingly. That meant someone who had access to her paperwork. Someone inside. She thought about who had access. 3 names, maybe 4. She filed those names in a column in her mind and moved on. She thought about Rafael Costa. Rafael had been Adriano's driver for 11 years before Adriano let him go. The official story was restructuring. They were shifting to a rotating security team, less exposure, better protocol. The real story, which Seraphina had pieced together at the time but never confirmed, was that Rafael had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to witness, and Adriano had decided that distance was safer than trust. Rafael had been paid well and sent away quietly, and Seraphina had always wondered what he'd done with whatever he was carrying. She made a note about Rafael. On the legal pad, in the dark, by feel. She couldn't read it in the morning, but she knew what it said. At 4:15, she got up, ran the shower cold for 90 seconds because that was what her body needed, dressed in yesterday's clothes, and sat at the small desk by the window until the city outside started showing signs of life. At 7, she called a number she had memorized years ago and never used. The woman who answered went by Claire, which was not her name. She was a private investigator who had done 3 pieces of work for the Falcone organization years ago. Clean, precise, untraceable. And who Seraphina had paid personally, in cash, from her own accounts that had no connection to the empire. Claire was 64 years old, had a voice like gravel, and had one rule. She didn't work for people she didn't trust. "I wondered when you'd call," Claire said. Seraphina paused. "Excuse me?" "Not specifically you, just these calls happen. After a certain point, they always happen." Seraphina let that settle. "I need surveillance. Full coverage. 1 primary subject and 2 secondaries. And I need financial forensics. I have a name and I need you to pull everything attached to it across any jurisdiction you can reach." "Vivian Sinclair," Claire said. The name landed. "You know her?" "I know of her." A pause. The sound of a chair adjusting. "She's done this before. Different city, different man, same structure. The shell core, the asset migration. The relationship that starts as an arrangement and becomes a hostile acquisition. She's good at it. Probably the best I've seen." Seraphina was quiet for a moment. "How many times?" "That I can verify?" 3. "There are 2 more that I suspect but can't prove." "Did any of them see it coming?" A beat. 1. A woman in Vancouver. She got out early enough to protect herself. Another beat. The others didn't. Seraphina looked out the hotel window at the street below. A delivery truck was idling at a corner. A woman in scrubs was walking fast, head down, coffee in hand. Ordinary morning. Ordinary world. "I'm not the others," she said. "No," Claire said. "I don't think you are." They agreed on terms. Seraphina gave her 3 account numbers. Clean money, untouched by anything Adriano knew about, funds she had been setting aside for years with a precision that was either paranoia or foresight depending on how this ended. They agreed on a communication protocol, dead-drop email addresses, rotating every 72 hours. Claire would send nothing in plain language. "Timeline?" Claire asked. "Fast enough to be thorough, careful enough not to spook them." 4 weeks, Claire said. "Maybe 6. 4, Seraphina said. "After 6 weeks, the landscape changes." She meant the baby. Claire understood without being told. She went back to her apartment only once in the first 3 days, and only to collect specific things, her personal files, the hard drive from the secondary office she kept off the bedroom, 3 passports, her own, one she had never used, and one Adriano didn't know existed. She went at 2 in the afternoon when she knew he would be at the downtown offices, moved through the rooms quickly and without sentiment, and was back in the car in under 20 minutes. She did not look at their bedroom. She did not look at the nursery they had set up together 6 weeks ago. A Sunday afternoon Adriano had actually spent at home, assembling furniture and arguing mildly about where the crib should face. She did not let herself remember how he had looked that afternoon. She could not afford to remember it and process it at the same time. One thing at a time. She had a friend, Dorothea, 61, a woman who had been through her own version of unraveling and come out the other side sharp and quiet and deeply unsentimental, who had a second apartment on the Upper West Side that she rented out occasionally. Seraphina texted her a single sentence, "I need somewhere to land." And Dorothea's response came back in under 2 minutes. "I'll have the keys for you by 4. No questions." That was Dorothea. Seraphina had always loved that about her. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like old paint, windows that faced a brick wall. Nothing like the Falcone residence, which was the point. She put her files in the second bedroom, her clothes in the closet, and the unmarked hard drive in a lockbox she'd bought at a hardware store on the way over. She stood in the middle of the living room. "Okay," she said, to no one, to herself, to the empty apartment. Then she sat down and started making calls. Adriano noticed she was gone on the second day. She knew this because Gideon told her, through the clean line, he called the apartment 3 times, sent 2 of his people to check. Playing it casual. Playing it casual meant he wasn't panicked yet. Wasn't panicked meant he hadn't connected her absence to the penthouse. He thought she could reconstruct his thinking clearly, having spent 20 years inside it. He thought she'd gone to stay with family. A hormonal gesture. Pregnancy was making her emotional, he'd decided. She'd surface in a few days wanting to talk about feelings. She almost smiled at that. On the 3rd day, he called her directly. She let it ring. Then she picked up. "Where are you?" His voice was controlled. Careful. "I needed some space," she said. Her voice was warm, tired, slightly congested, which was real. The hotel's dry air had done something to her sinuses. "The apartment's been feeling small lately. I'm at Dorothea's." A pause. "You should have told me. I texted you." She hadn't. "You didn't respond. I figured you were busy." Another pause, slightly longer. He was doing the calculation, checking the text he hadn't received, finding nothing, wondering if he'd missed it or if she was lying. The problem was he couldn't tell. She had always been unreadable when she wanted to be. It was something he had bragged about in the early years. "My wife has a poker face that could bankrupt Vegas." And now it was a wall. "You shouldn't be alone right now," he said. "With the baby, Dorothea's here. She's been very helpful." She paused. "How was the meeting? The Hartwell thing?" Nothing. Just nothing. A half-second vacuum of silence on the line that she could feel in the pit of her stomach because she knew what it meant. She had just handed him a question, and he had just run a very fast mental calculation about how to answer it. "Fine," he said. "It ran long. These things do." "Of course." She let her voice soften. "I know how those go. Get some sleep, Adriano. I'll call you tomorrow." She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment and breathed through the nausea that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. He didn't know. She was almost certain he didn't know. But something in that half-second pause had felt different from the ordinary lies she'd been absorbing for a year and a half. Something had shifted slightly in the way he was calculating, and she needed to understand what. She called Gideon. "He's nervous," she said when he picked up. "Not panicked, but something's moving." "I may know what," Gideon said. He sounded like he'd been awake for a while. "I got a call this morning from Marcus Dean." Marcus Dean was the organization's secondary accountant. Competent, quiet, loyal to whoever was currently signing his checks. What did he want? "He was fishing," Gideon said, asking about certain trust documents, which ones were current, which revisions had been filed recently. Careful questions. The kind of questions you ask when you're checking whether someone has been looking at things they're not supposed to. Seraphina was quiet. "Someone told them to check," she said. "That's what I think." "They're not sure I know. But they're not sure I don't know. They're running a verification." "Yes," she thought. "Don't give them anything. Whatever Marcus asked for. Stall. Paperwork delays, filing backlogs, whatever you need. I need 2 more weeks before anything looks different from their end." "I can do 10 days, Gideon said. "After 10 days, they'll go around me." "10 days is enough," she said. "Make sure it is." It was Lucinda who moved first. Seraphina had not expected that. She had expected Adriano to escalate, to push harder, to send someone more senior than Marcus Dean, maybe to appear at Dorothea's door himself with that particular expression he wore when he was trying to look concerned but was actually gathering information. She had prepared for Adriano. She had underestimated his mother. Lucinda Falcone called on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after Seraphina had left the penthouse hallway. She called on the main line, the number everyone had, the number Seraphina had been maintaining with careful normalcy, answering casually, performing slight variations of everything's fine, just resting. Doctor says stress is bad for the baby. "I'd like to have lunch," Lucinda said. Warm. easy. The voice of a woman who considered warmth a tool. Of course, Seraphina said. When were you thinking? Today, if you're free. There's a place I like on Park. Private room in the back. Private room in the back. No witnesses to the conversation, no one who might overhear. Seraphina's eyes moved to the notepad on her desk. I'd love that, she said. What time? She arrived first. She always arrived first. It was a habit she'd developed years ago, before she understood why it mattered, and had refined into practice once she did. Arriving first meant you saw who your companion arrived with, who they spoke to on the way in, whether they checked anything before sitting down. Lucinda arrived alone, or appeared to. Seraphina noted a man at the bar who had not ordered a drink and whose eye contact with the room was slightly too managed, but she said nothing and let her face stay warm and open. Lucinda looked well. She always looked well, 70 years old, immaculate in the way of women who had decided at some point that appearance was a form of argument. Ivory blouse, hair set, hands that had not done physical labor in 40 years but moved with the authority of someone who expected to be listened to. She kissed Seraphina's cheek. She smelled like the same perfume she'd been wearing for 30 years. You look tired, Lucinda said, sitting down, unfolding her napkin with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this motion 10,000 times. Third trimester, Seraphina said. Everyone's tired in the third trimester. Lucinda looked at the menu briefly. Though she already knew what she'd order, she always knew she had the kind of mind that pre-decided and then moved on. I've been worried about you. That's very kind. Adriano's been worried too. He says you've been distant. Seraphina looked at her, held the look for a moment. I've been nesting, she said. It's a real thing. The instinct to organize, prepare. The doctor mentioned it. Lucinda set her menu down. She looked at Seraphina directly, which was something she did when she was about to say something she'd pre-scripted and wanted to land cleanly. I want to speak to you honestly, Lucinda said. Woman to woman. Here it is, Seraphina thought. Please, she said. Adriano is under enormous pressure right now. The business, a slight pause, calibrated, is at a critical point. There are opportunities opening up that could define the next 20 years for this family, for your child's future. She folded her hands on the table. I think you understand, having been part of this as long as you have, that moments like this require everyone to be aligned, focused. Seraphina nodded slowly. What I'm saying, Lucinda continued, her voice dropping slightly in the practiced intimacy of false confidence, is that this is not a time for, careful pause, emotional turbulence for either of you. Whatever distance you're feeling right now, for the sake of the baby, for the sake of what you've both built, say the rest of it, Seraphina said. Lucinda looked at her. You're building towards something, Seraphina said, her voice still even, still warm, a woman having a lunch conversation. I can feel the shape of it, so just say it. A moment. Lucinda was not easily disrupted, but this disrupted her slightly. She had prepared for a longer path to the point, a more gradual excavation, and Seraphina had just cut the road short. There are conversations happening, Lucinda said carefully, about restructuring, about the best way to position the organization going forward. And I think it would be better for everyone, and especially for you, if you allowed those conversations to happen without resistance. Restructuring, Seraphina said. Yes. You mean the proxy transfer, the amendment from April. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of recognition, the precise moment when someone realizes they have walked into a different room than they thought. Lucinda's expression did not change. She was very good. But something behind her eyes shifted. I'm not sure I know what you're referring to, she said. I think you do, Seraphina said. She picked up her water glass, drank, set it down. You introduced them. You've been managing this for at least 2 years. The restructuring, the shell transfers, the document that was filed in April with my forged signature. She looked at Lucinda directly. I have the emails, Lucinda, the ones between you and Vivian. Nothing. Lucinda breathed in through her nose, once, slow. I don't know what... I'm not here to fight, Seraphina said. Her voice was calm. I want you to understand that. I'm not angry. I'm not hysterical or emotional or fragile. I'm telling you what I know so that you understand the situation clearly before any more decisions get made. She set her water glass down. Adriano thinks I walked away because I was hurt. I want you to keep thinking that. Can you do that for me? Lucinda stared at her. Don't tell him I know, Seraphina said. Not yet. That's all I'm asking of you today. And if I don't? The first crack in the composure, just a slight one, a tightening around the jaw. Seraphina looked at her evenly. Then the timeline accelerates and some of it gets uglier than it needs to be. For everyone. She paused. Including you. The waiter arrived. Seraphina ordered without looking at the menu. Lucinda ordered nothing. They sat in the private room with the sound of the restaurant muted around them, and neither of them spoke for a moment. You planned this, Lucinda said finally. Not an accusation, almost an acknowledgement. I've been planning things for 20 years, Seraphina said. You just stopped noticing. She was wrong about one thing. She found out 4 days later through Claire's network that Lucinda had told Adriano something. Not everything. Not the specific detail that Seraphina had the emails, but something. Enough. Because 3 days after the lunch, Adriano had a quiet meeting at the Caldwell penthouse with his head of operations, a man named Theo Bassett, who had been with the organization for 15 years and who Seraphina had always found unsettling in the particular way of very competent people who had no conscience. What was said at that meeting she didn't know yet. What she knew was what happened 2 days after it. Rafael Costa had been located. Not by her people, by Adriano's. Claire sent the message through the dead drop. They're looking for RC, sent 3 people to the address we have for him. He wasn't there. He's been gone for at least a week. Seraphina read the message in the kitchen of the Upper West Side apartment, standing in the gray morning light with a half-eaten piece of toast in her hand, and for the first time in 11 days she felt something cold move through her that was not calculation. If Adriano was looking for Rafael, it meant he knew, or suspected, that Rafael was a liability. That meant someone had told him Rafael might be talking, or might talk, or had already talked, which meant either there was someone in her circle who had communicated something, or she put the toast down, or Adriano had known about Rafael for longer than she'd thought, had known and had been watching and was now, with the timeline accelerating, deciding what to do about it. She called Claire on the direct line, broke protocol, which she almost never did. Where is he, she said. Still working on it. Claire's voice was tight. She knew what this meant too. Find him first, Seraphina said. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs. Find him before Adriano's people do. She ended the call. She stood in the kitchen. Outside, someone was playing music from an apartment above, something slow, something with a piano. And the sound came through the ceiling, muffled and distant. The baby moved. That slow roll. Elbow or knee pressing against her palm when she put her hand there automatically, without thinking, the way she'd been doing for months. She looked at the window. 14 months of financial fraud. A forged signature. A plan to strip the empire from underneath her while she was pregnant and present it to her as a settlement. 20 years of work, quietly repositioned, handed to a woman she had never met, orchestrated by a man she had trusted with the parts of herself she had trusted no one else with. And now they were looking for Rafael. She had 2 weeks before her due date. Maybe less. Her doctor had mentioned at the last appointment, casually, the way doctors mention things they considered technical details, that the baby was positioned slightly early, that she should not be surprised if things moved faster than the calendar suggested. She could not be in a hospital room when this broke open. She could not be unreachable. She could not be anywhere that Adriano could walk in and control the environment. She picked up the phone again, called Gideon. I need to move the timeline, she said when he answered. How far? Now. She paused. Not everything, but enough. I need the offshore accounts flagged before he can move the rest, and I need the trustee meeting scheduled. Not in 2 weeks, 10 days. Seraphina, Gideon. A long breath on the other end of the line. 10 days, he said. I'll need 3 things from you to make that work. Tell me. He told her. She wrote it down. 2 of the 3 things she already had. The third, a specific set of board minutes from 2018 that documented her original ownership structure and language, that was airtight in a way the later documents weren't. She knew exactly where it was. In the Falcone residence, in the safe behind the painting in the study. The safe that Adriano thought only he had the combination to. She had learned the combination 11 years ago. She had watched him open it once, standing in the doorway where he couldn't see her reflection in the window. And she had memorized the sequence because she was a woman who memorized things that mattered, and she had already understood, on some deep unlanguaged level, that information was the only currency that couldn't be taken. She had never used it. In 11 years, she had never needed to. She was going to need to now. She sat down. She looked at the wall. The baby moved again. Steadier this time. More insistent, like a hand pressing back. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach and breathed and looked at the wall and understood, with the clean, quiet certainty of a woman who had stopped deceiving herself, that the next move was the one there was no coming back from. She had given Adriano every opportunity to be different than he was. She had noticed things and been quiet. She had been patient and practical and had told herself 100 versions of the story that made his behavior survivable. She had loved him, really loved him, the inconvenient kind, the kind that stays past the point where it should. And she had stayed because leaving felt like giving up on the thing she'd poured herself into for 2 decades. She wasn't leaving now because she'd stopped loving him. She was leaving because she finally understood that what she'd loved had never fully existed, and what had existed had decided she was disposable, and she had a child coming into the world in approximately 2 weeks who was going to need someone with clear eyes and both hands on the wheel. She stood up. She got her coat. She was going back to the Falcone residence. One last time. In and out, 20 minutes, and when she left, she would be carrying the one document that turned everything that followed from complicated to inevitable. The point of no return had a specific address. She was going there tonight. She took a car she'd rented under a name that wasn't hers, paid cash at a lot on 58th that didn't ask questions, and drove herself. No driver. No record. The city at 11:15 at night had a particular quality. Not quiet exactly, but thinned out. The daytime noise compressed into something harder and more specific. Horns and bass from somewhere, the occasional siren threading through the grid like a needle. She knew the residence schedule, had lived inside it for 17 years. The night security rotation changed at 11, which meant the 45 minutes after the change were the softest. New pair of eyes, still calibrating, not yet settled into the particular alertness that came from an hour of watching nothing happen. She had filed this information away years ago, the way she filed everything, with no specific plan attached to it, just the understanding that knowing things was its own form of preparation. She parked 2 blocks out, walked the rest. The cold had gotten worse in the last week. A damp, particular cold that came off the river and moved through your coat rather than around it. She walked with her hands in her pockets and her collar up, and she breathed carefully, the kind of breathing she did when she needed her body to behave, when she needed her heart rate to stay at a number that would keep her functional. The side entrance was off the service alley. She had a key, had always had a key to every door of every property, a habit Adriano had once teased her about and now could not undo. She moved through the alley without hurrying, swiped the key, and was inside before the cold had a chance to fully arrive. The kitchen. Empty. The night staff left at 9 on Tuesdays. She knew that too. She moved through the kitchen into the hallway beyond it, her footsteps almost silent on the stone floor. She had worn flat shoes specifically, had thought about the floor, and she tracked through the ground floor toward the east staircase, the one that the staff used and that bypassed the main foyer where the security cameras had better coverage. She had counted on having the house to herself. She got to the top of the east stairs. The hallway stretched in both directions, dim, the kind of architectural darkness that expensive houses had at night. Everything shadows and quality, and the faint smell of the furniture polish the housekeeper used on Mondays. She turned right toward the study. She was 10 feet from the door when she heard voices. She stopped. 2 voices. Both male. One was Theo Bassett. She identified it immediately, that flat, unhurried baritone that had always made her think of someone who had long ago decided that urgency was for people who hadn't thought things through. The other voice she did not immediately recognize. Younger. Slightly uneven, the way voices got when the person speaking was working to sound steady. She stepped back against the wall. Breathed. The study door was not fully closed. Light leaked from the gap at the bottom, a thin yellow line across the hallway floor. She could hear them clearly enough. Said the meeting is already scheduled, Theo was saying. Mercer set it up yesterday. Trustees, main investors, 3 of the legal advisors. 10 days. A pause. The other voice said, he doesn't know what she's bringing to it? He knows enough to know he doesn't want it to happen. Theo again. Which is why we're here. Something shifted in Seraphina's chest. Not panic, something more controlled than panic, but with the same weight behind it. What's the play? The younger voice asked. Safe first. Get the 2018 minutes, the board documentation from the original trust formation, anything in there that supports her ownership claim. Take it all. Not just the copies, the originals too, the ones Mercer hasn't seen yet. Seraphina closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. They were here for the same thing she was here for. She had told no one about the safe except Gideon. She had not told Gideon when she was going. She had told him what she needed and left the method and timing to herself, which meant one of 2 things. Either Gideon had been compromised, or Adriano had independently identified the same gap in the documentation that she had. Given Theo Bassett's presence in the study, given the timing, given the very specific list of documents Theo had just named, she ran the calculation in real time, standing against the wall in the dark hallway. She didn't think this was coincidence. She didn't think Adriano had independently arrived at the same conclusion. Gideon. She would not think about that yet. She would not let it land until she was out of this hallway. Time frame? The younger voice. Tonight, before she makes another move. Theo paused. She heard the sound of something shifting. A chair, maybe, or a person turning. She's smart. Smarter than he gave her credit for, and he gave her a lot of credit. We don't wait. And if she comes here tonight? A beat, longer than necessary. Then we have a different conversation, Theo said. She understood what that meant. She understood it with a clarity that moved through her like cold water. Not ambiguous, not open to interpretation. Theo Bassett was not a man who made threats. He made statements about what would happen, which was different. She pressed her back against the wall and thought in the span of approximately 4 seconds. The safe was in the study. Theo and the other man were in the study. She could not get to the safe. She could not get what she came for. And if she stayed in this hallway, the probability that one of them would come out and find her was not 0. She moved. Back down the hallway, back to the east staircase, back through the kitchen. She moved at the pace of someone being careful rather than someone running, because running made noise, and noise was the one thing she could not afford. She was back in the alley, back on the street, back in the car. She sat behind the wheel and did not start the engine. Gideon. She picked up the phone, called the clean line. He answered on the 3rd ring, which was 1 ring longer than his usual, and that single extra ring told her something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to tell me the truth. Silence. Gideon. Ask me, he said. Did you tell anyone about the 2018 board minutes? About the safe? A longer silence. Not the silence of a man constructing a lie. She knew that silence, had heard it often enough over 20 years to identify it. This was different. This was the silence of a man deciding whether to say something that was going to change everything. Seraphina. Don't. Her voice stayed level, flat. Don't put words around it. Yes or no. He breathed, one slow exhale. Not intentionally, he said. She felt the floor tilt. Not physically. She was sitting still, hands on the wheel, engine off. But something structural shifted, the way it did in the penthouse hallway, that same rearranging of the world beneath her. Explain what not intentionally means, she said. I had a conversation with Marcus Dean 2 days ago. He was fishing again, like I told you, but he was more specific this time. He asked about the original trust documentation, the formation documents. I said something I shouldn't have. I didn't name the location, but I said the originals were intact and accessible. He would have taken that back to Theo. She closed her eyes. Gideon. Just his name. She didn't have anything else for a moment. I'm sorry. His voice had the quality of something genuinely broken, not performing. She had been studying Gideon Mercer's voice for 20 years, and she knew the difference. I was being careful. I thought I was being careful. He caught me at a weak angle with a question I wasn't prepared for. Theo Bassett is in the study right now, she said, pulling the originals. Silence. I couldn't get to it, she said. It's gone, Gideon. She heard him breathe. Once. Again. The sound of a man absorbing something that could not be unabsorbed. "How bad is it?" he asked. His voice was stripped now. No lawyer's caution, just the question. She thought about it honestly. She needed to think about it honestly because sentiment was not available to her right now. "Bad," she said. "Without the 2018 minutes, the ownership argument is circumstantial. Everything else I have builds toward it. The proxy documentation, the transfer evidence, the fraud records. But without the formation documentation, Adriano's lawyers can argue ambiguity in the original structure. They'll claim the proxy transfer was valid, that the amendment clarified a disputed arrangement, and they'll have enough gray area to slow everything down by months, possibly long enough to—" She stopped. Long enough for the baby to arrive, for her to be medically vulnerable, for them to push through whatever they needed to push through while she was managing an infant and recovering from childbirth. That was the plan. She could see it now with a completeness she hadn't had before. The timing wasn't accidental, none of it was accidental. Vivian Sinclair was not a woman who did accidental things, and Theo Bassett, who was currently in that study removing her only completely airtight piece of documentation, was a man who had spent 15 years being paid to make sure nothing was accidental. "I need to think," she said. "Seraphina, I'll call you tomorrow," she said. "On the clean line. Don't do anything until I call you." She ended the call. She sat in the parked car on the dark street 2 blocks from the house that had her name attached to its deed and her fingerprints on its walls, and 17 years of her life embedded in its rooms. And she let herself feel what this was for approximately 90 seconds, because 90 seconds was what she could afford. Then she started the engine and drove. She went back to the apartment. She made tea because her hands needed something to do, and she couldn't drink anything stronger. She stood at the kitchen counter with the mug and looked at the wall and rebuilt the entire structure in her mind from the ground up. What she had: the financial fraud documentation, the Shell Corporation transfers, 14 months of records, account numbers, and routing trails that Claire's forensic team had assembled with an attention to detail that was almost beautiful. She had that. Adriano's lawyers couldn't argue ambiguity on wire fraud records. She had the forged signature, the April amendment. Gideon had the comparison analysis from the handwriting examiner, who had put the probability of forgery at 96.3%, and that examiner had credentials that could not be dismissed in a courtroom. She had the emails between Lucinda and Vivian, most of them. Enough. What she didn't have now, the formation documents that established beyond dispute that the ownership structure of the Falcone empire had always, from the very first legal entity, filed in the autumn of the year she and Adriano had started building, included her controlling interest. Without those documents, the ownership argument was an argument. Winnable, maybe, but not certain. And not fast. She needed fast. She needed it resolved before a delivery room. She stood at the counter and drank her tea and turned the problem like a stone in her hand, looking for the angle she hadn't seen yet. Rafael. She set the mug down. Rafael Costa had driven Adriano for 11 years. He had been in the car for meetings, in the lobby for conversations, standing outside doors for approximately 4,000 hours of the organization's operational history. Adriano had treated Rafael the way certain powerful men treated their drivers, like furniture that happened to be literate, present, reliable, fundamentally invisible, which meant Rafael had heard things, seen things, filed things away in the particular way of someone who has been underestimated long enough to understand the value of what they're collecting. And Adriano was looking for him, had sent 3 people to his last known address and found him gone. Which meant Rafael had known they'd come looking. Which meant Rafael had been watching Adriano's behavior long enough to understand that being found was a problem. Which meant Rafael was scared. And scared people who had information were the most useful and most fragile resource in any situation like this one. She needed to find him first. She had told Claire that. Claire was still working on it. She reached for the phone, sent a message through the rotating dead drop. 6 words. Priority shift. RC is everything, now. Then she went to bed, lay on her back in the dark apartment with one hand on her stomach and the other stretched out flat on the mattress, and she made herself breathe until the rhythm became something she wasn't managing consciously, until it was just breath, just the body doing what it knew to do. The baby moved. Slow. Then a longer, stronger movement, more deliberate, The kind that had started in the last 2 weeks and made her feel absurdly like she was being consulted. "I know," she said quietly, to the dark. She slept for 4 hours, which was, under the circumstances, enough. Claire called at 7:18 in the morning. Not through the dead drop, through the direct line, which meant it was too time sensitive for the protocol. "I found him," she said. Seraphina was already awake, already dressed. "Where?" "Bus station outside Trenton. He's been sitting on a locker there for 4 days. He's got a bag, he's got a burner, and he's watching every person who walks through the door." A pause. "He's terrified." "Is he intact?" "He's fine. Adriano's people checked his apartment and his sister's place, and that's as far as they got. He's been one step ahead." Claire's voice had a cautious respect in it. "He's been smart about it." "Don't approach him yet," Seraphina said. "I'll go." "You shouldn't be—" "I'll go," she said again. Not harshly, just with the particular finality that ended that category of conversation. She drove herself. 2 hours, the morning traffic thick until she cleared the tunnel, and then the highway opening up, gray and flat, the kind of New Jersey landscape that looked like a stage set for things going wrong. She drove with the radio off and thought through the conversation she was about to have. Rafael Costa was 53. She had met him 8 or 9 times over the years. Not many. She was not usually part of the logistics. But she remembered a specific quality about him. He had the manner of a man who had survived by being useful and unobtrusive. But there was something in his eyes, at least in the time she had seen him, that had struck her as more present than his role required. He watched things the way people watched things when they were building a picture over time. She found the bus station by feel. Smaller than she'd expected, a gray building at the edge of a gray town. And she parked and went inside and found him sitting in a plastic chair near the back wall, a bag at his feet, a coffee cup long gone cold, his eyes on the door. He saw her the moment she came in. She watched his body tighten. He looked, briefly, like a man deciding whether to run, and she kept her pace even and her hands visible and her face as calm as she could make it. She sat down in the chair beside him, not across from him, beside him, the way you sat when you weren't interrogating someone. "I'm not with him," she said. He looked at her. His jaw was tight, 2 or 3 days of stubble. His coat one size too large, as if he'd grabbed it quickly. "I know that," he said. His voice was quiet, careful. "I knew something was happening with you when you disappeared. He paused, choosing the word, different, after. Different how? Nervous. He said it like it meant something specific. I've known Adriano Falcone for 11 years. I've never seen him nervous. Angry, yes. Cold, yes. But not nervous." His eyes went to the door and came back to her. "He sent people to my apartment 3 days ago." "I know." "Then you know I don't have much time." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." She paused. "I need to know what you have, what you've been carrying since he let you go." His hands, around the cold coffee cup, shifted slightly. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need it for?" he asked. "To end this," she said, "completely, without gray areas." "And what happens to me?" She looked at him, gave him the honest version rather than the reassuring version, because he would recognize the difference, and she needed him to trust her. "I can protect you during the legal process. Formal witness arrangements, temporary relocation, whatever Gideon can set up." She paused. "After that, I can't guarantee anything except that if I succeed, Adriano Falcone goes to federal court with enough evidence to put him away for a very long time, and the people he would have sent after you have other things to worry about." Rafael looked at her for a long time. The bus station moved around them, an announcement over the speaker, 2 teenagers arguing near the vending machines, a woman dragging luggage past with the determination of someone who had been traveling too long. "I have journals," he said. 11 years, dates, names, conversations I heard, things I saw. Specific. He held her eyes. "And I have encrypted files, copies of documents I photographed when I was asked to transport certain things. Financial records, letters. A specific set of communications from 2018 that Adriano thought were destroyed." The room went very still around Seraphina. "What kind of communications from 2018, she said. "The kind that proved the ownership structure of the organization was never disputed," Rafael said quietly. "Because Adriano himself confirmed it. in writing, to a third party. Before he decided it was inconvenient, she breathed, carefully. Once. "Where are the files?" she said. "Safe," he said. "Somewhere no one looks. I'll need your lawyer to arrange the formal handover. I'm not doing this informally. I want documentation that I cooperated voluntarily." "I can have Gideon call you within the hour," she said. "Not Mercer," Raphael said. She went still. His eyes were direct, careful. 2 days ago, one of Adriano's people reached out to someone close to Mercer. Not Mercer himself, someone in his office. I don't know what passed between them, but I know the call happened. Something in Seraphina's chest did a slow, complicated thing. Not Gideon deliberately, but someone near Gideon, inside the structure she had trusted, passing information to Adriano's side, which meant the radius of her secure circle was smaller than she had thought, possibly much smaller. "Not Mercer," she repeated. Her voice did not change. "Understood," she thought. She needed outside counsel, a name Adriano had no access to, no history with, no leverage over. Someone who operated outside the network she and Adriano had spent 20 years building together. She had one name, a woman named Sandra Voss, who had spent 20 years as a federal prosecutor before going private, who Seraphina had met once at a conference and had filed away the same way she filed everything. She had never met Adriano. She had no relationship with any entity connected to the Falcone organization. She was the right call. "I have someone," Seraphina said. "Clean. No connection to anything you're worried about." She paused. "Can you stay in Trenton until tomorrow morning?" "I can stay in Trenton," he said, "but not longer." "Tomorrow morning." She stood. Her body registered the effort. 7 months and the last 3 weeks had not been kind to her sleep or her nutrition, and she steadied herself against the chair back without drama. "Don't contact anyone else. Don't tell anyone I was here." He nodded. She walked back toward the door. She was halfway across the room when his voice came from behind her. "Mrs. Falcone." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not pity. She would have noticed pity, and it would have landed wrong. Something more complicated. The look of a man who had been watching a situation for years and was finally watching it move. "He used to talk about you," Raphael said. "In the car, early on. Not to me, to whoever was in the back seat. But I heard." He paused. "He used to say you were the only person he was actually afraid of." She looked at him. "He forgot that," she said. She pushed through the door into the cold. Sandra Voss took the call on the second ring. Seraphina had pulled over on the highway, hazards on, traffic moving past her at 70 miles an hour, and she explained the situation in 6 minutes without embellishment. Voss listened without interrupting, which was the sign of a certain kind of intelligence, the kind that understood that interrupting a person laying out a complex situation only gave you their reaction to the interruption rather than the situation itself. "Gideon Mercer's been your primary?" Voss asked when she finished. "Yes. There may be a breach adjacent to him. Not him. Adjacent. I'm not certain of the extent." "Okay." A pause. The sound of a pen. "What's your timeline?" "The trustee meeting is in 10 days. I need everything prepared and airtight before then." She paused. "I also have approximately 2 weeks before I give birth." Voss was quiet for a moment. "You've been managing this while pregnant?" "Yes." "All right." The pen again. "Send me what you have through the secure email I'm giving you right now. I'll have a first assessment back to you within 24 hours, and I'll arrange the formal handover with your witness." She gave Seraphina the email address. Seraphina wrote it on the back of her hand. "One more thing," Voss said. "The financial fraud records. Are they with you or with Mercer?" Seraphina thought about it. The primary set was in the lockbox in the apartment, copies with Gideon. "Both," she said. "Get the copies out of Mercer's office," Voss said. "Tonight if possible. If there's any breach adjacent to him, physical documents are the first thing to go." She was right. Seraphina already knew she was right. "I'll handle it," she said. She pulled back into traffic. The highway stretched ahead of her, gray and long. She drove for a mile, 2 miles, the city resolving ahead of her in the distance, and she felt the whole shape of what was happening reorganize itself into something that was worse than she had originally understood, and also, somehow, more workable than it had been 12 hours ago. She had lost the formation documents from the safe. She had lost a margin of security inside Gideon's office that she hadn't known was gone until it was. She had discovered that Theo Bassett had anticipated her enough to move first. But she had Rafael Costa. And Rafael Costa had 2018 communications that Adriano himself had written, confirming what Adriano was now trying to destroy. The thing about 20 years was that you couldn't edit it. You could try. You could hire people to remove documents and run forensics on hard drives and send 3 men to a bus station in Trenton. But 20 years was still 20 years. The evidence of it existed in too many places, in too many forms, in the memories and records of too many people who had seen what they'd seen and kept what they'd kept. Adriano had built an empire. He had built it the way men like him built things, loudly, on the surface, with his name on everything. But Seraphina had built the foundations, and she had been smarter about whose name went where. She was almost back to the city when her phone buzzed. A message through the dead drop. Claire. 4 words. They found the apartment. Her hands tightened on the wheel. They knew where she was staying, which meant the rotation of her location had to happen tonight, immediately, before she went back for the lockbox. Or instead of going back, if she couldn't get there first. If the documents were already gone. If Theo Bassett had moved faster than she'd thought. If this was already over before Sandra Voss had read a single page of what she'd sent. She made herself breathe. She was 7 months pregnant, alone in a car on a highway, running out of safe addresses and secure lawyers and originals of documents that proved she was owed everything she was fighting for. She had been in hard places before. Not this hard, but hard. She had one rule for hard places. You did not collapse, you did not freeze, and you did not make decisions from fear. You made them from the next available piece of information, and then the next, and then the next, until you were either out or you weren't. She was not out yet. She picked up the phone, dialed Claire. Is anyone at the apartment right now? 2 of Theo's people, Claire said. They went in 40 minutes ago. They're still inside. The lockbox, Seraphina said. I don't know if they found it. She did the math. The lockbox was in the 2nd bedroom, inside the closet, behind a false panel she had installed the 2nd week she was there. A habit, again, not a plan. She had bought the panel at the same hardware store where she'd bought the lockbox itself. It was not sophisticated. It was the kind of thing that held against a casual search and did not hold against a thorough one. 40 minutes was long enough for a thorough one. She drove and felt the world narrow around her the way it did in the worst moments. Not a spiral, not panic, just the raw physics of a situation getting smaller and faster at the same time. She needed one thing to hold the center, to keep the argument from becoming merely circumstantial. Raphael's files would help, but not until they were formally transferred, verified, submitted. That took time she did not have. What she needed right now, tonight, was something she could walk into that trustee meeting with in 10 days and put on the table in a way that could not be disputed, delayed, or made to disappear. She was still thinking about what that was when the 2nd message came through. Not from Claire. From a number she did not recognize. 4 words and an address. I have what you need. She stared at the message, pulled over again. The city ahead of her, the highway behind her, the cold dark pressing against the windows. The address was on the Lower East Side. A street she recognized, near the waterfront, the kind of block that had been industrial once, and was now halfway between that and something else. The kind of place where people met when they didn't want to be seen meeting. She did not know the number. She did not know who had sent it. She sat with the phone in her hand and understood that what she was looking at was either exactly what she needed or the most dangerous thing that had happened to her yet. And the only way to know which one was to go. She sat with the phone for 40 seconds, counted them. Not out of habit this time, but because she needed the 40 seconds to be honest with herself about what she was considering. The address was real. She pulled it on the rental car's navigation, and it resolved immediately. A specific building on a specific block. Not an empty lot or a fake location designed to send her somewhere that didn't exist. That meant whoever sent this had a physical location and was willing to be found at it. That was either confidence or a trap. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between walking out of tonight with what she needed and not walking out at all. She thought about who knew enough to send this message. Theo Bassett knew where she'd been staying, but Theo would not send a message like this. Theo did not negotiate, he removed. Adriano would not send it either. Not directly, not yet, because Adriano still believed, or had believed until recently, that she didn't know the full extent of what was happening, and a message like this would confirm that he knew she knew. Vivian Sinclair. The thought arrived quietly and settled with a weight that felt like recognition rather than speculation. Vivian, who had built her entire life on the structural logic of leverage, who had done this before, 3 times that Claire could verify, 2 more she suspected, who was, at this moment, watching the Falcone organization begin to fracture in ways that were not part of the original plan, whose arrangement with Adriano had been built on the premise of a clean acquisition, a cooperative divorce, a quiet transfer of power. Not this. Not federal investigators and offshore accounts frozen and a wife who had vanished and reappeared at every point she was supposed to be gone. Vivian was smart enough to know when a position was becoming untenable. She was smart enough, Seraphina thought, to understand that the woman who had built the empire from underneath was a better ally than an obstacle. She started the car. She drove to the Lower East Side. The building was a converted warehouse, 4 stories, the kind of renovation that had retained the bones of the original structure. Exposed brick, industrial windows, freight elevator still functional in the lobby. A woman was waiting just inside the entrance. 40-something, sharp-eyed, the particular composure of someone employed to be the first face in a room. She looked at Seraphina without surprise. "Second floor," she said. "The elevator." Seraphina took the stairs. Old habit. Stairs gave you 4 seconds longer to think than elevators, and 4 seconds was not nothing. The second floor was a large open space, most of it in shadow, lit by 2 standing lamps near the far windows that overlooked the waterfront. The river was visible in the distance, black and moving, the lights of the opposite shore scattered across it. Vivian Sinclair was standing at those windows with her back to the room when Seraphina came off the stairs. She turned around. In the penthouse, glimpsed through a gap in a door, Vivian had been a silhouette, an impression, a dark-haired figure with her hand on Seraphina's husband's chest. Now, in lamplight, she was a real person, 46, Seraphina's research had told her, though she looked younger, the particular preserved quality of someone who had made looking younger into a professional asset. She was composed. Not performing composure, actually composed, the way people were when they had decided how a conversation was going to go before it started. Seraphina walked to the center of the room and stopped. She did not close the remaining distance. She wanted space, and she wanted it on her terms. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You sent the message yourself," Seraphina said, "not through an intermediary." "Yes." "Why?" Vivian's eyes were direct. Gray, or close to it, the kind of color that changed depending on the light. "Because intermediaries talk," she said, "and this conversation doesn't exist." "Agreed." Seraphina looked at her evenly. "What do you have?" Vivian crossed the room in 4 steps. Unhurried, the movement of someone who was used to being watched and had stopped thinking about it, and stopped at a low table near the lamps. On the table was a flat case, the kind used for documents. She opened it. Inside, in a neat stack, were papers. "Adriano's personal communications," Vivian said. "The ones he kept on a device he believed I didn't know about. I've had copies of the content since February." Seraphina looked at her. "February," she said. 5 months ago." "Yes." "You've been keeping insurance." "I've been keeping options," Vivian said. There was no apology in her voice, no self-justification either. She stated it the way you stated a fact about weather, something that was true and didn't require your feelings about it. Among those communications are 3 exchanges between Adriano and his legal team from 2018 concerning the ownership structure of the original trust. He confirmed, explicitly and in writing, that the controlling interest was yours. He was trying to get advice on how to eventually restructure around that fact. She paused. His lawyers told him it would take years and would require your cooperation. He said, and I'm quoting from memory, "Then we take years." The room was very quiet. Seraphina's hands were still at her sides. She kept them still. "You know what those communications are worth," she said. "Yes." "And you're giving them to me." Vivian held her eyes. "I'm making a decision about which side of this I want to be standing on when it lands," she said. "Adriano told me 6 weeks ago that the situation with you was contained. Then you disappeared, The account started freezing, and Theo Bassett began running around the city at 11 o'clock at night pulling documents out of safes. She paused. That is not a contained situation. That is a situation that is ending in a specific way, and I would prefer not to be the person holding the bag when it does. You helped him plan this, Seraphina said. Not an accusation, just the ledger. Yes. Again, no qualification. I understood what I was doing, and I did it anyway because the financial incentives were substantial and because I believed he was in control of it. A beat. He is not in control of it. You are. Seraphina looked at her for a long moment. What do you want? She said. In exchange. Two things. Vivian said it without hesitation, which meant she had prepared this list and rehearsed the delivery and had decided she was going to be direct about it rather than perform reluctance. First, I'm not named in whatever you file. The fraud documentation, the civil case, whatever. Mercer or whoever you're using takes into court. My cooperation is the condition of my removal. And second, Vivian breathed in once. The Vancouver situation, 3 years ago. There is a woman there who has certain documentation of her own relating to a prior arrangement. I need to know that documentation doesn't resurface in any proceeding connected to this. Seraphina filed that. The Vancouver woman, the one Claire had mentioned, the one who had gotten out early. Not a victim. A prior version of this same structure, a prior woman who had found her way to the other side. I can make inquiries, Seraphina said. I can't make guarantees about evidence I don't control. Inquiries are sufficient. Vivian looked at her steadily. I know what you're thinking. You're wondering if this is another layer of the same operation, if Adriano sent me here. Yes, Seraphina said. I'm wondering that. He didn't. Flat, certain. Adriano thinks I'm at the St. Regis. He thinks I've been there since yesterday. He doesn't know about this building, this meeting, or the copies I've had since February. A pause. He also told me, 3 nights ago, that if things became legally complicated, I should understand that I had been acting independently, and he would not be in a position to protect my interests. The air in the room changed slightly. He cut you loose, Seraphina said. He suggested, with his characteristic grace, that I was on my own. Vivian's mouth moved in something that was adjacent to a smile but had nothing warm in it. So no, he didn't send me. Seraphina walked to the table. She looked at the document case. She did not pick it up yet. I'll need these verified, she said, by morning. I have the authentication chain, Vivian said. Digital metadata, the device they came from, a third-party verification from the technician who extracted them, all in the case. Seraphina picked up the case. It was heavier than it looked. Real weight, the weight of paper and volume, of a lot of pages, of years of correspondence. She looked at Vivian. If any of this is fabricated or altered, she said, in any way that creates problems in verification. It isn't, Vivian said. I need this to work as much as you do. She almost believed her. The part of her that had survived 20 years in a world where almost no one said exactly what they meant, and meant exactly what they said. That part was running the numbers. Vivian needed an exit. The documents were real leverage only if they were real. Manufacturing fake documents would be a risk with no commensurate reward. The incentive structure pointed toward the documents being authentic. Almost. I'll be in touch through an intermediary, Seraphina said. Clean, within 48 hours. She turned and walked to the stairs. Mrs. Falcone. She turned back. Vivian was standing where she'd left her, hands at her sides, the lamplight making her look older than she had in the first moment, or maybe more real. The performance quality stripped away, just a woman standing in a warehouse having made a decision she could not unmake. I'm not asking for your sympathy, Vivian said. I know what I did. Good, Seraphina said, because I don't have any to give you right now. She went down the stairs. She drove 3 miles before she stopped at a gas station and sat in the lot and opened the case in the passenger seat under the overhead light and read for 22 minutes. She read carefully, the way she read everything that mattered. Not fast, not scanning, but fully, every word, tracking the language for inconsistency, for the particular flatness of fabricated dialogue, for timestamps that didn't align. They aligned. The 2018 communiques were exactly what Vivian had described. 3 exchanges between Adriano and his legal team. Clear, explicit, his own words confirming what she had always known to be true and what he had spent the last 14 months trying to architecturally destroy. She put the case on the back seat, face down, under her coat. She called Sandra Voss. "I have it," she said when Voss picked up. "The 2018 documentation, Adriano's own communications. I need you to have someone verify the authentication chain tonight." A beat. "Tonight." "Tonight," Seraphina said. "I need it airtight by 8 tomorrow morning. The trustee meeting is in 9 days and I'm moving it up." "Moving it up to when?" 4 days. Silence on the line. "Seraphina, can you do it or not?" A longer pause. She could hear Voss running calculations on the other end. What was possible? What was insane? Where those two things overlapped? "I can do it," Voss said. "But you need to understand that 4 days is not enough time to build a complete legal framework. It's enough time to establish the core claims. Everything else follows." "Everything else can follow," Seraphina said. "I just need the core to land first." "Then yes." A breath. "Send me what you have. Encrypted. The address I gave you." She would. She would send it as soon as she was somewhere with a secure line. First, she needed somewhere to go. The apartment was compromised. Possibly the documents inside it compromised too, and she needed to know before she could think about the next 8 hours. She called Claire. "The lockbox," she said. "Tell me." "Still intact," Claire said. There was something in her voice, the tightness of someone who had been holding difficult news at a careful distance and had just been given permission to put it down. They searched the second bedroom. They found the false panel. But the lockbox needs a biometric key, which they didn't have, and they didn't have time to force it before I had someone make noise in the alley that spooked them out. "They're gone," Seraphina breathed. "The documents are there?" "They were there 40 minutes ago. I'd moved them anyway." "I'm going there now," Seraphina said. "Can you have someone on the street outside?" "Already there." She pulled out of the gas station. Back into the city grid, the lights thicker now, later at night, and the particular population that occupied the city's later hours filling the sidewalks. No one paying attention to a woman in a rental car carrying a document case under a coat on the back seat. She got to the apartment, went up the stairs, went directly to the second bedroom. The false panel had been moved. They had found it, Claire was right. But the lockbox was intact, the biometric surface unscratched, no evidence of forcing. She pressed her thumb to it. It opened. Inside, the full fraud documentation, 14 months of financial records, the forged signature comparison analysis, copies of the Lucinda Vivian emails. She put it all in the document case with Vivian's materials, closed the case, picked up her coat and her phone, and walked out of the apartment without looking back. Outside, a woman she didn't know was standing near the entrance reading something on her phone. She looked up briefly when Seraphina came out. That was Claire's person. Seraphina nodded once. The woman looked back at her phone. She drove to a hotel in Midtown, different from the first one, paid cash, different name, and went to the room and laid everything out on the bed. 2 in the morning. She had been awake for 19 hours. Her back had been sending her specific signals for the last 4 hours that she was processing as information rather than responding to because she could not respond to them yet. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the full spread of what she had. Vivian's documents, the fraud records, the forgery analysis, the emails, Raphael's formal handover, which Sandra was arranging for tomorrow morning. It was enough. She was almost certain it was enough. She sent the authentication materials to Sandra Voss's encrypted address with a 4-line cover note. Then she called Gideon. He picked up on the first ring. He had not been sleeping. "I need to tell you something," he said before she could speak. "I already know," she said. "Someone near you talked. I don't think it was you." A long exhale, the sound of relief and guilt arriving simultaneously. "Marcus Dean had someone inside my filing system, a paralegal. She's been there 8 months. She didn't know what she was feeding back. She thought she was doing research for a document review." He stopped. "I found it tonight. I've been trying to reach you." "It doesn't matter now," Seraphina said. "What matters is what we do in the next 4 days." She told him about moving the trustee meeting, about the documents she now had, about Sandra Voss. She heard him process all of it in the silence that followed, The particular silence of a 61-year-old attorney who had survived a career in difficult rooms and knew what enough sounded like. Sandra Voss is a good choice, he said quietly. She's better than me for this. You're not out of this, she said, but I need you specifically on the organizational documentation. The pieces only you can authenticate by virtue of how long you've been in this. No one can replace that. I can do that. I know. She hung up. She set the phone on the nightstand. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved immediately, as if the hand were a signal. That same steady pressure, small and insistent. 4 days. She lay back on the bed without undressing, her hand still on her stomach, and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel the weight of it all at once. Not to be crushed by it, but to measure it. To know exactly what she was carrying. It was a lot. It was more than it should have been. It was the consequence of 2 decades of choosing to trust the wrong person with the wrong things while quietly protecting the right things in the right places. She thought about the anniversary gift in the hotel nightstand in the first place she'd gone. That first night. The watch. Still wrapped. She had not been back for it. She wondered briefly if Adriano had gone home that night and found the apartment empty and thought she was simply staying with Dorothea. Had probably poured himself a drink and thought about the settlement, how it would be handled, how she would be managed, how the practical woman would ultimately accept the practical outcome. She wondered if he had any idea, in this moment, what was 4 days away from him. She thought not. She thought he was still calculating against an old map, a version of her that had existed before the elevator, before the hallway, before the anniversary gift sitting wrapped and undelivered in a nightstand she was never going back to. He had called her practical. He had been right. He just hadn't understood what a practical woman with 20 years of proof and 4 days of runway could build. Her phone buzzed. Sandra Voss. Authentication confirmed on first review. Materials are exactly what they appear to be. We're in good shape. Get some sleep. She read it twice, set this phone down, closed her eyes. She would sleep for 5 hours. Then she would start making the calls that would dismantle everything Adriano Falcone thought he controlled, one by one, starting with the offshore accounts and ending in a room full of trustees who had no idea, until they sat down and saw what she'd put on the table, that the woman they had treated as a peripheral figure had been the primary author of everything they'd built their security on. 5 hours. She allowed herself that. Then, at the precise moment the clock on the nightstand read 7 a.m., she sat up, put both feet on the floor, and reached for her phone. The first call was to the lead trustee. His name was Bernard Holst, 71 years old, 30 years in finance, a man who had no loyalty to anyone who could not demonstrate clear legal standing and irrefutable documentation. "Bernard," she said when he picked up, "I need the meeting moved, 3 days from now. I know it's short notice." She paused. "I have documentation that changes the nature of everything you think you know about this organization. And you need to see it before anyone else moves anything else." A pause on the line. Bernard Holst breathing. "What kind of documentation?" he said. "The kind that ends a conversation," she said. Another pause. "I'll make the calls," he said. She ended the call. She stood up. She went to the window and looked at the city, early gray light, the day starting whether anyone was ready for it. She was ready. The meeting was set for 72 hours out, by the time Seraphina had finished the morning's calls. Bernard Holst had pulled it together faster than she'd expected. He was, as she had always assessed him, a man who understood that being slow in certain situations was its own form of liability. 12 trustees, the 4 primary investors, 3 legal advisors, 2 independent auditors that Sandra Voss had insisted on, and Seraphina had agreed to immediately. She spent the next 48 hours in the kind of work that was invisible from the outside. Document preparation, verification chains, the specific sequencing of how evidence was presented so that each piece landed in the order that made the overall argument not just provable, but undeniable. Sandra Voss was good. She was, Seraphina recognized with something like gratitude, exactly the kind of person you needed in the room you were about to walk into. Precise, prepared, completely without sentiment, and constitutionally incapable of being impressed by people who thought their power was permanent. Rafael Costa's formal handover happened on the second day. He came to Sandra's office, clean, arranged, documented, and laid down 11 years of journals and a set of encrypted files that, once decrypted by Sandra's technician in 4 hours of careful work, contained exactly what he had described: financial records, photographed documents, specific communications that filled in the remaining gaps in the fraud narrative with a thoroughness that made Seraphina, reading the summary at midnight on the night before the meeting, feel something she hadn't felt in weeks. Certain. Not hopeful. Certain. There was a difference, and it mattered. She called Claire. "Adriano," she said. "What's he doing?" "He's been at the Caldwell penthouse since this morning," Claire said. "He had a 3-hour meeting with Theo this afternoon, 2 calls to offshore counsel, 1 call to Vivian that she didn't answer." Seraphina absorbed that. "He's trying to reach her. 4 times in the last 2 days." He knew then, or was close to knowing. He had felt the shift, the offshore accounts, the trustee communication that Bernard Holst had sent out under the formal organizational protocols that Adriano had no authority to override. And he was trying to stabilize, trying to reach the pieces he thought he still had, finding some of them unavailable. "What's his manner?" she asked. "Calm or moving?" "Moving," Claire said. "Fast." A fast-moving Adriano Falcone was a dangerous one. She knew that. A still one was calculating, a moving one was reacting, and a reacting one was capable of things a calculating one would veto. "The meeting is tomorrow morning," she said. 9 a.m. "I know. After 9, it doesn't matter what he does." She paused. "Before 9, I need you watching the Caldwell. If Theo moves, I need to know immediately." "Understood." She set the phone down. She was in Sandra Voss's conference room, which had become, over the past 48 hours, a kind of operational center. Documents across the table, 2 of Sandra's associates working separate threads on laptops. The evidence organized into a physical sequence that told a story so complete and so corroborated that Sandra had said, at 10 o'clock the night before, that she would be comfortable walking into a federal proceeding with it. Seraphina looked at the table, at the stack of material in front of Bernard Holst's seat, prepared for tomorrow morning, at the copies in front of each other chair. She thought about the penthouse, the door that was not quite closed, the laugh. She thought about the anniversary gift, still in a nightstand somewhere. She had not gone back for it. She thought about 20 years. Then she thought about tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. A room full of people who held the legal and financial structure of the Falcone empire in their hands, who were about to learn that the structure had always rested on a foundation they had not fully examined, that the woman they were expecting to see exit quietly had not exited, had in fact been the one holding the load-bearing wall the entire time. She thought about Adriano walking into that room, because she had arranged for him to be there. That part, the specific, deliberate arrangement of Adriano Falcone's presence at the trustee meeting, was the piece she had not shared with Sandra, not with Gideon, not with Bernard Holst. She had sent the invitation herself through the formal organizational channels, in the name of the majority ownership position that the documents on this table were about to unambiguously establish. He would come because he would think it was still his meeting to control. He would come because not coming would be an admission, and Adriano did not make admissions. He would walk in expecting to find a table arranged in his favor, and he would find something else entirely. He would find her at the head of it. She picked up her phone, checked the time. 11:47. 8 hours and 13 minutes. The baby moved. Slow roll, then a harder press. Elbow, knee, she still couldn't always tell, against her palm when she laid her hand there. "One more day," she said quietly. She stood up, straightened the documents in front of her chair, and picked up her coat. On the way out, Sandra's associate, a young woman, late 20s, who had been working with a focused intensity that Seraphina had noted and respected, looked up from her laptop. "Mrs. Falcone," she said, "we'll be ready." "I know," Seraphina said. She went to the elevator, rode down, walked out into the city night, the cold air hitting her face, the street almost quiet at this hour. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Tomorrow she was going to walk into a room and put 20 years of evidence on a table and watch the man who had built his whole understanding of power on the assumption that she would eventually disappear, discover that she had never been going anywhere. She was 7 months pregnant, operating on fractured sleep, having survived 2 weeks of a dismantling that was supposed to have left her with nothing, and she had never in her adult life felt more fully like herself than she did standing on this sidewalk at 11:50 at night, with the city humming around her and 8 hours standing between her and the moment that changed everything. She stood there one more moment, let the cold do what cold does, clear the head, sharpen the edges, make everything that isn't essential fall away. Then she walked to the car. 8 hours. She arrived at the building on Park Avenue at 8:17. 43 minutes early. Sandra Voss was already there, in the lobby, in a dark suit with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and a coffee in each hand. She held one out without ceremony. Seraphina took it. They rode the elevator to the 14th floor without talking, which was the right call. Everything that needed to be said between them had been said over the past 72 hours in that conference room, and what remained now was not conversation, but execution. The meeting room was long, formal, the kind of room that had been designed to communicate seriousness through its proportions. High ceilings, a table that could seat 20, windows facing east so the morning light came in hard and direct. Seraphina had chosen it for exactly that reason when she'd confirmed the location with Bernard Holst. She wanted the light at her back and in the faces of the people across the table. She walked to the head of the table and set her materials down and did not sit yet. She stood and looked at the room and let herself have 10 seconds of something that wasn't quite peace, but was adjacent to it. The particular stillness of a person who has done everything they could do and is now at the point where doing gives way to being. Her back hurt. Had been hurting since 4 in the morning with a specific rhythmic quality that she was deliberately not analyzing too closely because she did not have time for what that analysis would tell her. She had taken the mild painkiller her doctor had approved, and she had drunk 2 full glasses of water, and she had told herself that the body could manage 60 more minutes of professionalism before she would allow it to have its conversation with her. The trustees began arriving at 8:40. Bernard Holst came first, as she'd expected. He was the kind of man who arrived early to everything, who considered being on time a form of discourtesy. He was 71, white-haired, the compact build of someone who had played squash until his knees made other plans. He looked at Seraphina standing at the head of the table, and something moved through his expression that she read as recognition, not of a fact, but of a situation. He had been in enough rooms over enough decades to understand, from the positioning alone, what kind of meeting this was going to be. "Seraphina," he said. "Bernard." She shook his hand. "Thank you for making this work on short notice." "When you said what you said on the phone," he replied quietly, "I understood it was not optional." He looked at the document stacks in front of each chair. His jaw tightened briefly. "How bad is it?" "Bad," she said, "but manageable. That's why we're here." He nodded once and took a seat 2 chairs to her right, which was the position of someone who was signaling alignment without committing to it before the evidence was presented. She noted that and moved on. The others filed in over the next 15 minutes. She knew most of them, had spent years in rooms with them, had attended dinners and events, and the particular theater of organizational life that required you to perform relationships you may or may not have actually had. She watched their faces as they saw her at the head of the table, watched the recalibration happening behind their eyes. This was not the meeting they had expected when the notice went out. They had expected Adriano. They had expected, perhaps, an announcement, a restructuring, a transition, the kind of organizational shift that powerful men announced from the head of long tables. They were getting that, just not the version they'd anticipated. Adriano arrived at 8:58. She heard him before she saw him, the particular cadence of his footsteps, which she had memorized without intending to over 17 years of shared floors. He came through the door with Theo Bassett a half step behind him, and he was doing what Adriano always did when he entered a room he expected to own. He was already talking, finishing a sentence to Theo, his coat still on, the ease of a man who considers his arrival the event. He got 3 steps into the room before he stopped. He saw her, at the head of the table, with Sandra Voss to her left, and the document stacks in front of every chair, and Bernard Holst already seated, and 12 sets of eyes tracking the exact moment Adriano Falcone registered that this room was not arranged in his favor. His face did not collapse. She had not expected it to. Adriano had survived 20 years in a world that punished visible weakness, and he had never been a man who let his face say things before his mind had decided what to say. But she saw it. She had been reading his face for 2 decades, and she saw the precise moment the ease left it, the way a light goes off rather than dimming, sudden, complete, the room different the instant it happened. He looked at her. She looked back. She did not smile. She did not signal anything. She simply held his eyes the way you held something that was heavy and that you had been carrying for a very long time. "Adriano," she said. Her voice was level. "Sit down." He did not move for 3 seconds. Theo Bassett put a hand on his arm. Not pushing, just the light contact of a man communicating information through touch. "This is not the room we thought it was." Adriano looked at Theo, then back at her, then at the documents in front of the chairs. He sat down. Not at the head. There was no seat for him at the head. He sat mid-table, where the place marker with his name was, and Seraphina watched him understand what that meant. The place marker with his name, placed by her, in the middle of the table. She sat down. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "I'll be direct. What I'm about to show you changes the legal and operational foundation of everything this organization has done for the past 14 months. Some of what you're going to see will be surprising. Some of it will be disturbing. I ask that you hold your questions until the full presentation is complete, because the questions you have at the beginning will be answered by what comes after them." She nodded to Sandra Voss. Sandra opened the first document. It took 94 minutes. Seraphina had run the presentation in her head so many times over the past 3 days that it had acquired the quality of something memorized, a piece of music she knew so well she no longer had to think about the notes. But the thing about presenting evidence to a room full of people who are actively processing it is that you feel the weight of it differently than when you're alone with it. She felt the room shift as the first financial documents went up. The Shell Corporation structure, 14 months of transfers, the routing trails that led from Falcone organizational accounts through 3 jurisdictions and into accounts registered to entities connected to Vivian Sinclair. She felt the shift again when the forged signature came up, when Sandra put the comparison analysis on the table and the handwriting examiner's report beside it and let the numbers speak for themselves. 96.3% probability of forgery. She watched faces. Bernard Holst's face went through 3 distinct phases: surprise, anger, a settling into something harder and more resolved that she recognized as the expression of a man deciding what he was going to do next and not being conflicted about it. The investors to Holst's left, 2 men she had known for years, who had always treated her with the particular courtesy of people who considered her peripheral, were very still. The kind of stillness that preceded either action or surrender, and she could not yet tell which. She did not look at Adriano for the first 40 minutes. She was disciplined about that. She needed to maintain the sequence, the presentation, the logic of the evidence in the order it had been arranged, and looking at him would pull her off the thread. She was human enough to know that. At the 41-minute mark, when Sandra put Rafael Costa's materials on the table, the journals, the photograph documents, and specifically the 2018 communications between Adriano and his legal team, his own words confirming the ownership structure he had spent 14 months trying to destroy. She looked at him. He was reading. She had expected anger, visible anger, the particular hot kind that Adriano produced when he was cornered. She had seen it maybe a dozen times over 20 years, and it always arrived with a specific physical signature. The jaw, the hands, the way his posture hardened from controlled to rigid. She had braced herself for it. What she saw instead was something she had never seen on his face before. He was reading the documents in front of him, his own words from 8 years ago, before he had decided she was expendable. And his face was doing nothing, not because he was controlling it, because the machinery behind it had simply stopped. He was looking at what he had written with his own hand to his own lawyers, and the expression of a man looking at evidence of his own miscalculation was not anger. It was something closer to the absence of everything else. When Sandra presented Vivian's materials, the communications she had held since February, authenticated and verified, Adriano's own voice cutting her loose 3 nights before the meeting, Seraphina heard a sound from mid-table. Not a word, just a breath, pushed out with a force that had nothing voluntary about it. She still did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the room. By the time Sandra finished, the room was the kind of quiet that was not peaceful, the kind that comes after something large has been said and the air hasn't settled from it yet. Bernard Holst spoke first. "The ownership position," he said. His voice was careful. controlled. The voice of a man who had processed the information and arrived at the professional question before the personal one. The original trust formation. You're saying the majority controlling interest has always been hers. Has always been hers, Sandra confirmed. The 2018 documentation, cross-referenced with the formation filings and the original shareholder agreement, establishes this without ambiguity. The April amendment was fraudulent. The proxy transfer was executed without consent and is therefore void. The controlling position has never moved. Bernard nodded, slowly. And the financial transfers. Wire fraud. 14 months of documented activity. We've notified the relevant federal authorities. Those notifications went out at 9:15 this morning. Sandra said it with the flatness of a woman reading a grocery list. The accounts that haven't already been frozen will be. The room absorbed that. Federal. Already notified. Already in motion. One of the investors, the older one, the one who had always reminded Seraphina of a man perpetually calculating whether he was in the right room, turned to Adriano. Adriano, he said, just the name. A question and an accusation in 2 syllables. Adriano looked up from the documents. He looked at the investor. Then he looked around the table, at the faces, at the evidence, at the room that had been arranged by someone else, and that he had walked into believing he could reverse once he arrived. He did this slowly, like a man taking inventory of a house after a fire, room by room, floor by floor, cataloging what was gone. Then he looked at Seraphina. For a long moment, he didn't speak. She held his eyes. She did not give him anything, not anger, not satisfaction, not the soft edge of 20 years that part of her still carried despite everything. She gave him nothing, because anything she gave him he would use, and she was done with that. How long, he said. His voice was quiet. Stripped of the quality it usually had, the authority, the ease, the fundamental assumption of being listened to. Just a voice. Just a man asking a question. How long what? She said. How long did you know? She looked at him. The night I found you. He breathed in. And before that. How long were you? He stopped. Started again. The formation documents, the ownership structure. Did you plan that? From the beginning? She considered the question honestly, the way she had always considered honest questions. I planned to protect myself, she said. I didn't plan for you to be the reason I'd need to. The room was very still. That's the difference between us, she said. I built foundations. You built surfaces. When the surfaces needed replacing, you came after the foundations. You just didn't realize I was still standing on them. He looked at her for another moment. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully name. Complex, layered. The expression of a man who had arrived at the end of a very long sequence of choices and was encountering the full accumulated weight of them all at once. Then Theo Bassett said, from his seat at the far end of the table, "We need to speak with counsel." "Yes," Sandra said pleasantly. "You do." The formal decisions took another 3 hours. Bernard Holst moved through the structural resolutions with the efficiency of a man who had been preparing for this kind of emergency restructuring his entire career, and was grimly grateful to finally have a clean mandate. The trustees voted. The investors followed. The independent auditors confirmed what Sandra had put in front of them. Each vote was recorded, each resolution documented, the legal architecture of the Falcone organization quietly and irrevocably rewritten around the woman sitting at the head of the table. Adriano did not participate in the votes. He sat where he was and said very little, and when he did speak it was in the brief, careful sentences of a man who had been advised by Theo, through low, urgent exchanges, to say as little as possible given what was already in the room. He complied. That compliance, Adriano Falcone, who had never in his life accepted a room he didn't control, sitting quietly and complying, told her more about the state of things than anything else in the meeting. At the end, when the formal business was complete and the room was beginning the low murmur of dispersal, Adriano stood. He looked at her. She looked back. "The baby," he said. Low, just for her. She held his eyes. "Is mine," she said. "My child. My decision. What that looks like going forward is a legal matter, and it will be handled as one." His jaw moved. "Seraphina, don't," she said. Not harshly, just firmly, the way you closed a door. "Don't do that now. There's nothing you can say in this room that changes what happened in the last 14 months, or what I saw in that hallway. She paused. Your lawyers will be in contact with mine. That's how this goes now. He stood for another moment. She thought he was going to say something else. She could see it gathering in him, whatever it was, something that was not legal strategy, something more human and less useful. She didn't let him get there. Go home, Adriano, she said quietly. He went. Theo Bassett followed him. The room emptied in stages, people pausing to shake her hand, to exchange words with Sandra, to do the particular social management of a situation that had upended their professional world and that they were still integrating. She accepted the handshakes and said what was appropriate and kept her face steady and her back straight and waited until the room was nearly empty before she allowed herself to put her hand on the table and lean on it slightly. Bernard Holst was the last one left, other than Sandra. He stood beside her chair and looked at her with the expression she had first seen when he arrived, that recognition of a situation rather than a fact. You know this isn't over, he said. The federal side of it. That will take time. His lawyers will fight. I know. And the organizational transition, I know, she said. I'm not under any illusions about what comes next. I just needed today to happen first. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the voice of a man saying something he didn't say often, I've been in finance for 45 years. I've sat in a lot of rooms. He paused. I've never seen anything like what you just did. She looked at him. Yes, you have, she said. You've just never seen a woman do it. He considered that, nodded once, with the gravity of someone accepting a correction they've earned. I'll be in touch, he said. He left. Sandra Voss sat down across from her, set her reading glasses on the table. They looked at each other across the evidence, across the room, across the morning that had been building toward this for 3 weeks. How's your back? Sandra said. Seraphina almost laughed. Not great. The rhythmic kind? She paused. Yes. How long? Since 4 a.m. Sandra looked at her with an expression that combined professional admiration with something that was probably qualified as exasperation. You conducted a 94-minute evidentiary presentation while you were in early labor. I was not going to postpone the meeting. I know you weren't. Sandra stood. I'm calling your doctor, and then I'm driving you. Sandra. Non-negotiable, Sandra said. You've had your non-negotiables for 3 weeks. This one is mine. The hospital was quiet when they arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon. Not the emergency quiet of something going wrong, but the steady procedural quiet of a place that handled the full span of human experience as a daily matter of course. Seraphina was admitted, assessed, installed in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and something underneath it that was just clean. And Sandra sat in the chair by the window and worked on her laptop and did not fill the silence with conversation, which was exactly right. Gideon came at 4. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, which was accurate, and he sat in the second chair and did not speak for several minutes. I wanted to come to the meeting, he said finally. I know. I should have caught the paralegal earlier. Yes, she said. You should have. She looked at him. You also should have told me sooner that you noticed the financial irregularities. Both things are true. You've been my lawyer for 20 years, Gideon. You're still my lawyer. He was quiet. His hands clasped in his lap tightened slightly. I'm sorry, he said. It was the simple version, not elaborated, not qualified, just the 2 words. I know, she said. Dorothea arrived at 5:30 with food she'd made herself, containers stacked in a bag, the kind of food people made when they wanted to do something useful, and cooking was what they had. She set it on the windowsill and sat on the edge of the bed and held Seraphina's hand without speaking, and that was the right thing too. Dorothea had always known the difference between the moments that needed words and the ones that needed just another person in the room. Claire sent a message at 6:17. Theo Bassett lawyered up at noon. Federal investigators contacted him at 3. Adriano has not left the residence. Seraphina read it and set the phone face down on the blanket. She had thought, in the weeks leading to this, that she would feel something specific when it was over. Relief, maybe. Or the particular grim satisfaction of having done what needed to be done in a situation that did not reward sentiment. She had thought it would feel like something finishing. It felt like something else. More complicated and less clean than finishing. The way any large thing felt when you'd been inside it for long enough that you could no longer see it from outside. You knew it was ending, but you couldn't yet locate yourself on the other side of it. She thought about the first time she and Adriano had sat across a table together. A dinner, 23 years ago, before the empire, before everything. When he was a man with ambition and rough edges and a laugh she had found genuine. She had been 29, she had been practical even then, but she had also been moved by him, and that was the truth she had been least willing to look at directly over the past 3 weeks. He had moved her. The person she had thought he was, before the surfaces replaced the substance, before the ambition consumed the man. That person had been real, or real enough, and loving him had not been a mistake she made out of naivety. It had been something she had chosen with her full intelligence and had paid for with her full life. That was the part that didn't simplify, the part she was going to have to carry forward and learn to set down and pick back up again as she was able. At 8:47 p.m., her son was born. It was not dramatic. It was not easy. It was the ordinary, extraordinary thing that it was, hours of her body doing something enormous and unglamorous and utterly indifferent to the events of the day preceding it, and then a moment, and then the sound of him. And then he was there, actual and separate, his own person from the first second, furious at the cold and the light and the indignity of arrival the way all new people were. They put him on her chest. He was warm. He was angry. His hands, both of them, gripped the air with a reflexive urgency that made her chest do something that had no name in any language she knew. She put her cheek against the top of his head. She breathed. She did not say anything for a long moment because nothing was adequate, and she had learned over a difficult life that when nothing was adequate, the right response was silence. Then she said quietly, to the top of his head, "I've got you." That was all. That was enough. Sandra was in the hallway. Dorothea was crying in the chair by the window, not quietly, the full open crying of someone who had been holding it for weeks and had finally found the moment when it was the right response. Gideon had stepped out when things became active and came back when it was over and stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and his eyes doing something complicated. She looked at Gideon. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stood beside the bed and looked at the baby with the expression of a man for whom the morning's events and this moment existed in the same day and were equally real. "What's his name?" Dorothea asked, surfacing from her crying with the particular practical energy of grief converting itself into interest. Seraphina looked at him. She had thought about this, had been thinking about it for months, in the background of everything else. The name, the weight of it, what it was supposed to carry. "Marco," she said, her grandfather's name, not Falcone, her side. The weeks that followed were not peaceful. She had known they wouldn't be. The federal investigation moved with the institutional speed of something that was thorough rather than fast. And Adriano's lawyers were as expensive and as combative as expected, fighting at every procedural level, dragging timelines, seeking delays. She had anticipated this, and Sandra managed it with a surgical patience that Seraphina came to understand was one of the woman's greatest professional gifts. She ran the organizational transition from a temporary office she set up in a different building, not a Falcone property, not anything connected to the old structure. And she did it with Gideon on her left and Sandra on her right, and Bernard Holst on the phone at least twice a week. It was the hardest sustained work she had ever done, which was significant because everything she had ever done had been hard. The legitimization of the empire's holdings, the conversion of structures built in shadow into entities that could exist in light, required a complete architectural rethinking of how the organization operated, what it held, how it was governed. She had known it would require this. She had been building towards it, quietly, for longer than even she had fully acknowledged. Marco was present for most of it, in the particular logistical way of new mothers who refused to be separated from their children and also refused to stop working. He slept in a bassinet in the corner of her office. He was brought to her for feeding and then returned to the bassinet. Her assistant, a woman named June, who was 43 and profoundly unflappable, managed the transitions with a matter-of-fact competence that Seraphina recognized and valued. Rafael Costa was formally deposed in the 3rd month. His testimony, delivered in the specific detailed manner of a man who had been keeping receipts for 11 years and was relieved to finally put them down, provided the federal investigators with a timeline that closed the remaining gaps in the fraud narrative. He was relocated afterward, the arrangement Sandra had made good on. Seraphina did not know where he went and did not ask. Vivienne Sinclair left the city before the federal proceedings formally widened. She was not named in the initial filing, per the arrangement. The Vancouver documentation, the prior arrangement, the woman who had gotten out early, was a thread that ran its course in other jurisdictions, other proceedings, in ways Seraphina did not track and did not need to. She had given what she'd said she'd give, inquiries. What came of those inquiries was not hers to manage. Lucinda Falcone contested nothing. That surprised Seraphina, briefly. Until it didn't. Lucinda was a woman who had spent her life understanding which way power ran and adjusting accordingly, and the power in this situation had run its course. She issued no public statement. She did not seek contact. She retreated to the Connecticut property that had been in her name independently of the empire and which the legal proceedings did not touch, and she stayed there. Seraphina did not reach out to her. There was no conversation she wanted to have with Lucinda Falcone that would produce anything useful for either of them. There were things she could have said about the Christmas Eve dinner, about the hand-holding, about being told she was loved by a woman who had been engineering her removal for 2 years at the same time. She could have made Lucinda sit in a room with those things. She chose not to. Not out of mercy exactly. Out of the understanding that some conversations cost more in the having than they return, and she had spent enough of herself on people who were not worth the expenditure. She was done with that. Adriano stood in federal court on a Thursday in late autumn. Seraphina was not there. She had been present through the civil proceedings, the organizational matters, the ownership disputes, the financial resolutions, because those required her presence. The criminal matter did not. She followed it through Sandra and through Gideon and through the specific, measured updates that Bernard Holst provided with the same careful economy he brought to everything. The case was overwhelming. That was the word Sandra used in her summary call. Overwhelming. The kind of evidentiary weight that left very little room for reasonable doubt and considerable room for plea agreements, which was the direction Adriano's defense ultimately moved in the third month of proceedings, when it became clear that the alternative was worse. She was in her office when the call came. Marco was in the bassinet. It was raining outside, a cold, steady autumn rain that had been coming down since morning. She heard the settlement terms from Sandra's voice, and she wrote the key points on the notepad on her desk in her small, precise handwriting. "He'll serve," Sandra said. "Minimum 8 years given the federal fraud statutes involved and the scope. Possibly more depending on what the investigators pull in the extension of the inquiry. And the organizational assets? The remaining disputed holdings resolve in your favor. The shell entities are formally dissolved. Everything else we've been transitioning is clean." She set the pen down. "Okay," she said. A pause on Sandra's end. "How are you?" She thought about it. She was 3 months postpartum. She had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 90 days. She was running a major organizational transition while managing a federal proceedings aftermath, while feeding a human being every 3 hours. Her back still hurt from a night that now felt like it had happened in a different year. She had not cried since the hotel room on the night of the anniversary, that 90-second window in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner. And she was not sure when she would again, or if the machinery for it was still intact. "I'm getting there," she said. "That's enough," Sandra said. 6 months later, Seraphina stood in the lobby of the building that now housed the legitimate headquarters of what had been rebuilt from the Falcone holdings. The name on the building was not Falcone. It was her name, her grandfather's name, the one she had given Marco, carried forward into the structure she had rebuilt from ground level up. She had a meeting in 20 minutes. A board meeting. A real board, legally constituted, independently governed. The kind of thing the original empire had never been and could not have been given what it was built on. She had spent 6 months making it real. It was real now. She stood in the lobby and checked her phone, and there was a message from June. "Marco's awake and annoyed. Also, your 9 o'clock confirmed." She almost smiled. She was 49 years old. She had spent 20 years inside a structure that had been built partly by her hands and aimed partly at her destruction. And she had come out the other side of it with her child and her name, and the organization reoriented around a foundation that was hers, legally and structurally, and in every way that held. She was not grateful for what had happened. She would not perform that kind of resolution, the kind that softened hard things into lessons, that wrapped damage in meaning, that turned betrayal into the origin story of someone better. She was not better for having been betrayed. She was herself, surviving, building, continuing, in the way that people did when they had no other acceptable option. But she was still here. That was not nothing. In fact, standing in this lobby with 20 minutes before a meeting she had built the conditions for, it was the thing she had to work hardest not to underestimate. She was still here. She put her phone in her pocket and walked to the elevator. The doors opened. She stepped in. She pressed 14. She thought briefly about an elevator she had ridden down 42 floors in a building across the city on a night 3 months before this year began, with a wrapped anniversary gift in her purse, and the sound of a laugh she had never heard before following her all the way to the lobby. She thought about it for exactly the length of the ride. Then the doors opened on 14 and June was in the hallway with Marco on her hip. He was 6 months old and had the particular intense expression of an infant who had recently been woken against his will. And he saw her and the expression changed, not to the uncomplicated joy of movies, but to something more specific and more true, the particular settling that happened when he registered her presence. She took him. He grabbed her collar with both hands, the reflex grip, strong and certain. "Okay," she said to him quietly. "Let's go to work." She walked down the hallway toward the meeting room, her child's hands fisted in her collar, the morning stretching ahead of her, unwritten and hers.